Darrelyn, we are very excited that you can be with us today on such a short term, and we're looking forward to your presentation. So the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yoka. Thank you very much. It's just wonderful. It's a thrill to be here, to be able to connect with the Dutch Astrology Association. The whole, you know, I know that there's several groups amongst you, and I know that there's, you know, that you've amalgamated at one point. But Bernadette and I both feel very close to the Dutch astrologers, and it's just wonderful. Thank you for inviting me to do this and for being the first astrologer to beam in this way. It's a great honour. And happy birthday too for you, for your 20th birthday celebrations. As they say, you're old enough to vote, nearly old enough to drink. It's an old one, but a goodie. But no, it's just wonderful. And I am recording this so that you can access it later. I'll be putting it up on the Astrologos website, and I'll let Yoka know when that's there. So if you want to revisit any of these ideas, then you can do. All right, I'm going to share my screen, and we can get going with this. I'm not sure what Yoka has told you with regards to this work, but it is ongoing work that I've been doing now since 2007. And it seems to be part of, it's not letting me go. The first part of it was how do astrologers read charts. So I started investigating how we do what we do. And that's really what the whole process is about for me. There's many of us who teach astrology and teach it really well, the techniques of how to do it and how to be with a client in a consulting room. And I think that's part of our tradition and our heritage, and it keeps on going through time, despite the different polemics that we have from those who think that astrology is not of the highest level, shall we say, as science might be. But nevertheless, we do get these polemics, and over time we've had various astrologers who try to engage with the public and to show why it's not a silly thing to do. And in a way, I think my work that I'm doing in this stream, not the teaching of the techniques of it, but this stream that I've been doing is part of that ongoing dilemma. How do we stand up for ourselves, make a bridge to the public to say that actually what we're doing has got a heritage and a tradition, and it not only fits into what we know about astrology, but it also fits into a wider field of people who've investigated what people do. So if we know what it is we do, then we're in a much stronger situation. We're less vulnerable to censure and to condemnation. And that's where this stream of work fits in. So it started off in 2007. I started investigating it, and it became published in 2011. And I've made that available to Yoka to send around. And that's how do astrologers read charts? What do we actually do? Not the technique, but what happens inside us when we read charts. And this is the second part of that, I suppose, which is what is the nature of that space? Is it sacred? Because a lot of people talk about the idea of magic and awe and extraordinariness, which we all feel that's what draws us in to being astrologers. We not only experience it when we have a consultation for the first time, but then as we start to consult our own clients, we step into that space. But what is it? What is that space? And a lot of people think that it's calling in the gods, or it's encountering divination of some sort, or it's sacred, or what is it? So I really wanted to investigate that. And it seems this is not letting me go, this whole process, because next year at the Astrological Association of Great Britain, I'm also going to be taking it further and talking about hope and fear. What happens inside the consulting room? What are the questions that clients come to us to investigate? But back to this particular presentation of whether the client comes, is it a sacred space or not? And as I said before, if we know what it is we do, and we can situate that experience, the phenomenology, into previous work in the field by those who are outside the field, but we can make a bridge to that, then we are in a stronger position to defend ourselves. And that's what I was looking at. We know when a client comes to see us for a horoscopic reading that we know by looking at the chart, we know what those symbols represent, but we also know that there's so many possibilities within the shape of each of those symbols, and we know that there's extremes that behavior pattern can lead to, and we know what its worst case scenario is, and we also know what its best case scenario, but we have no idea of the life experience that the client has and that they bring to us. And the client is on the other side of that spectrum, and they come knowing all of their life experience, knowing how they've expressed that, but no knowledge of the symbols of astrology that could be linked to their life, and therefore how they could be better expressed. And they meet in this place, in this extraordinary place that they come to, and there is this meeting, and it is on one level just an exchange of information. The astrology is saying this, how have you experienced it? I've experienced it like this. But we know that it's much, much more than an information exchange. We know that it's something extraordinary happens in that space. And so one way of expressing that is from Ling Bell, whom many of you would probably know, and some may have even had astrological readings from her. She's an American-born, Paris-based astrologer, an author, teacher, and a consultant. And she's been doing this work since 1972, so she has a lot of experience behind her. And when I asked her about this feeling of awe that she had in reading a horoscope, and when it first happened for her, she said she was very interested in quite a few things when she began, and she began at a very young age. As most of us do, we get drawn in by the curiosity of what our life is about, and we seek ways of understanding that in some way. And she says, I was interested in quite a few things, but becoming an astrologer was a weird choice. And she laughed. And she said, it's not exactly first on your grown-up list. Maybe now it is, because we've got the whole millennial generation who seem to be just eating it for breakfast and much more knowledgeable perhaps, or maybe it's more spoken about in society today than we may have been. But she said, I had a conversation with a friend, this is way back when, in her 20s, and the friend said, what is it that you really love? And I said, well, when I do astrology, something happens. She said, there it is. There's that thing that we talk about. Something happens in the space of the astrological consultation that doesn't happen anywhere else. And she paused and she heard herself and she repeated it more slowly. She said, something happens that doesn't happen anywhere else. There's a kind of, and she was trying to put it into words, there's an energy, there's a how would you say, a flow of energy and a heightened perception, a heightened awareness, an exchange with another person that's of a very different nature than anything I do in my life. And she said that was when she was in her 20s, and that's why she chose to do it. It was a brave choice in her 20s. But, we always tell our clients, find what it is you love to do and then do it. Make that your profession, make that your vocation sometimes. So she moved towards that, and that's how she began. She recognized it was a very uncommon choice at that stage as a career, and possibly it is now too. It wasn't what she thought a mature adult would choose to do. But the experience that occurred in the space of that reading was so strong, she wanted to keep going there. She saw it as unique. So where do we go? What is this space? Where do we go when we read a chart? We're in a physical environment, but there's something else, some other place we seem to go to. So I wanted to know, is it a sacred place? Is it an insightful place? what happens. So this brings us to the word place. Place is definitely a contributing factor because we read it in a particular place, usually an office or a home, but something else happens. And I knew that I was reaching for something that was ineffable. And so the way to actually put it into some sort of context or environment meant that I had to go outside the field of astrology, because as far as I know, this is not something that we've necessarily investigated before. And so I went to the work of Edward S. Casey, who's an American philosopher and a university professor, still alive. And in a context that's separate to astrology, he named these meaningful places where personal enrichment could flourish, and we'd all have to agree with that. It's a place where something really rich happens. He called it a thick place. That's a lovely word, isn't it? Because it's not just the mundane place that we are in when we have conversations with people. It's something that's much thicker and deeper and full. And these are places, he said, where a person felt connected and assured, where a densely enmeshed infrastructure offered value and relationship. And that's what we're doing as astrologers, isn't it? We're setting up a framework and an infrastructure where something of value can be discussed. And he defined place as the immediate ambience of my lived body and its history, including the whole sedimented history of cultural and social influences and personal interests that compose my life history. And when you break it down, what he's really saying is it's the person who comes, it's me, it's my culture, it's my history, everything that's affected me in my own engagement with the world, and also that which is around me and shaping that. And it's easy to see that the most effective reading of a horoscope occurs in such a thick place. You know, we've all had those readings where you think, nothing's happening, it hasn't happened, hasn't connected. They're few and far between. They often occur when we're young, when we start off in the business of reading charts, because we're unsure of ourselves. But as we become more reliant on our skills and ability, we know that those wonderful times of reading a chart for someone is where the person feels connected and assured. It is where we have this densely enmeshed infrastructure that offers real value to the client. So in order to explore this, in my previous work, I'd actually run questionnaires and sought responses from quite a lot of people. And this time I wanted to narrow it down. I wanted to narrow it down to just a small handful of astrologers. So between 2015 and 2016, I interviewed 7 astrologers. And my criteria was they had to be writing or teaching astrology for at least 25 years or more. I wanted this depth. I wanted this sense of longevity and maturity that comes to us the more we do client work. And I also wanted that length of history for each of the interviews that I was doing, because then they would have, I hoped, they would have more of an ability to be able to discuss with clarity the process they were going through. I just wanted them to talk about the phenomenology, what it felt like. And all of them were active in the community. The demographics were the UK, France, Australia, and the US. Interestingly enough, 5 of the 7 astrologers were born in a country different to where they now lived and practiced. 5 out of the 7 were female. That seems to be the ratio of practitioners in astrology, although there are still quite a lot of male practitioners. And all were over the age of 47. So they were well past their first Saturn return and the midlife crisis. So they were on the other side of all of that tumult, if you like, but having brought it into their life experience. They all identified themselves as professional astrologers. In some way, they were either astrological consultants, They were teachers of astrology, authors of texts, translators of astrological texts, publishers of astrological texts or of astrological software. They were people who'd held conferences, convened conferences, and they were also astrological business consultants. So I felt I had a wide array of experience within the astrological consulting teaching field where I could get enough disbursement to be able to find something of commonality. And also in this process, I had known and been colleagues with all 7 the people that I interviewed for at least 30 years. So there was that level of trust I hoped I would gain from doing these interviews. And alongside the work that I do as an academic at the University of Wales, Trinity St David, I also brought insider knowledge of what it was to be a practitioner. So I felt that I stood at a unique point of the interview where I could relate to and be empathic to the process that they were discussing, and then also relate it into this wider field, and thus make our process available to those who might scoff at or diminish what we were doing. So let me introduce them to you. You've met one of them, Ling Bell, because I've quoted her before. We've got also Roy Gillett, who's the president of the Astrological Association. I'm sure that you are familiar with him. There's Brian Clark, who was born in Canada and now lives in Australia and has been practicing for many, many years with his school Astrosynthesis. Mira Epstein was born in Israel and she now lives in New York, and she in particular is a translator of astrological texts. Her favourite author is Ibn Ezra. Melanie Reinhardt was born in Zimbabwe and now practices in London and has been doing that for many, many years. Wendy Stacey, I think she was born in New Zealand, yes, and she now, of course, lives in the UK, in London, and is very active in the Astrological Association of Great Britain, but also runs the Mayo School of Astrology. Ling Bell I've introduced you to, and Barbara Dunn is a horary astrologer, and I think she's one of the ones who, she and Roy was born in New Zealand as well. Barbara, I think, was born in the UK and has lived here all her life. And she's an electional, a horary astrologer, and a very fine one at that. And there's an interesting spin with a horary astrologer because they do things slightly differently. But I thought it was worthwhile interviewing Barbara because she would have that slightly different focus on the astrological space that we move into. All of them had, it seemed, come to astrology as the result of some sort of crisis. And if you think back on how you moved into astrology, it's probably true for most of us that we're looking for something that will give us an idea of what's going on in our life. And it is through a crisis we've tried everything else and we come to it as a final resort and then find that it just takes over our life. So looking for previous scholars who had examined ideas about place, because that's what we're looking at. What is this place? We've talked about the thickened place. I then turned to Emile Durkheim, who's a French sociologist. And in his book, Elementary Forms of Religious Life, he differentiated the idea of space, he said. He saw sacred space as socially constructed, but then he said it's a special place set aside and reinforced by ritual. Now, I'm defining ritual here as repeatable action to achieve an end. So it can be something that has anything accrued to it. It can be ritual in a religious sense, but it can also be something that we do habitually that creates, it achieves an end. And I think what Durkheim is doing here in particular, he's talked about space, but he's also talked about place. And my question is it is it sacred space that we do in this place that we see clients. So we're really looking at place as form, some sort of physical environment. And in this regard, I also bring in the internet, because a lot of us do client work over the internet, but we still have a physical environment in which we do it. But space is the content inside that form. Space is social, Durkheim says, is socially constructed. So what does he mean by this? And is this how the astrologers I interviewed saw it? And Brian Clark says that, and he was not the only one, but he felt that there was the necessity to clean the physical space of the room before the client arrived. So to prepare the physicality around him so that something could enter into that place that was of a different quality. And he referred it as creating space for the client to enter. So he's preparing the physical environment so that there is this qualitative space for the client to enter. And he said, I call it sacred space, but I don't mean sacred in terms of, you're dressing up and bowing down and doing the right thing. I just mean sacred in that you've created the space that's, and he called it a temenos. If any of you know Brian Clark, you'll know that he's really focused on Greek history, and he did his MA in that area. So he calls it a temenos. And a temenos originally referred to a temple enclosure surrounding a sanctuary, a piece of land that was marked off from common uses and dedicated to a god, a holy grove or a garden, that sort of area. So you have a special area that was set aside for something that wasn't mundane. And he goes on, you've invited somebody into this space, and in this space, this is what you're going to do in this space. There's nothing else that's going to happen there. So he cleans it so that a particular thing can happen there. He likened the physical area in which he read the horoscope to a temenos because it was dedicated to that one piece of behavior. And this is very much like Durkheim was suggesting, that there's a special place set aside and reinforced by ritual. Now, the ritual that Brian was doing and that the other astrologers I interviewed were doing was to clean the space, to clean it physically in some way. Brian was also adamant that he was the one who was doing the cleaning. He wasn't leaving it up to anyone else. He didn't have a cleaner come in and clean the space. He had to do it. So he was also putting his energy into the space. And then he said he could then hold that space mentally. He could watch his thoughts as they came through, and he could help the client in this way. And he also qualified that when he first saw clients, and this might be something that you also did, when he first saw clients, he would offer them a cup of tea. But this suggested that it was a leisure activity, that it was something that was more socially engaging rather than how the space was actually going to be used. So he says he doesn't offer them a cup of tea now. Now, there are social rituals, aren't there, about strangers who come into your house, that one of the first things you do, certainly in the UK and in Australia, is you make them feel welcome. You offer them a cup of tea. But there is merit in what he says, is that offering a cup of tea puts them into a different type of expectation. And so now he brought them in, and then that helped him to know that this is all he was going to do in this space. Melanie Reinhardt also talked about this. She says that the cleaning, the physical cleaning for her occurred in parallel with her mental preparation. Her intention in cleaning the space was to make herself ready, willing, and able to be of service to the person or the process. So that she saw, as she swept the dust or ran the vacuum cleaner over it, she was also cleaning herself so that she was ready for something to enter that space. She said, I get to spend a minimum of 1 hour, sometimes way longer, depending on what these issues are, focusing on that individual's life. She said, and I take that very seriously. And she said she kept her space free of any external images so that she could stay focused on the person. Other astrologers do different things. They like to use images which help to amplify points they're talking about. But for her, it was keeping the space clear. Barbara Dunn said that as a horary astrologer, she didn't actually see people and talk through the chart with them in the way that we would understand. But she said making the decision to take on the interrogation for her was akin to cleaning the space. And she would do this by telephone. And I said, well, how do you make that decision to take on the interrogation? What's the process for her? What's her ritual of creating that space? And she said, if I know it's not a great time, I won't. She said, I'll say to the client, ring me back. So she's looked at the time that the client's going to ring her. She's seen the chart and she says, no, this is not right. The space is not right to do the work. She said, I'll often do that because I'm trying to, and she was reaching for how to express this. She said, in a way, you're almost electing the moment of the interrogation if you do that. Sometimes clients say, no, I want to speak now. They really insist on it, but she tries to steer them away from what she sees is a bad day. And she says, ring me back in a week. So she knows that the space isn't ready. That was how she saw it. And Maya Epstein said that her preparation beforehand is that she works like crazy to bring herself to the point where she says, I'm under the skin of that person. I understand the energies to the point that I don't exist. When I start the session on that level, Meira, she was referring to herself, doesn't exist. I am that person. I'm so identified with the chart that I'm in their chart. So for her, the ritual of preparing the space was to actually step into the chart so that she understood it completely. For all of these 7 astrologers, the cleaning ritual of the place, which was also parallel for the astrologer's body and their mind, that was the shaper of their chart reading space. It was a habituated pattern that was also a comforting thing. And it was undertaken as a preparation not only of the physical space, but also a way of readying themselves. And so in this regard, they were doing what Durkheim had suggested, as well as another author in this field, Kim Knott. And she says, ritual takes place and makes place. We might just adjust that by saying ritual takes place and makes space. And Knott goes on to argue that it was the actions that the person engaged with, the preparatory cleaning, that sacralized these spaces. And those embodied spaces could be ordinary. So it could be a home or an office. It didn't have to be somewhere that was full of incense or in a church. It didn't have to be a particular place that we might think was sacred. It's just an ordinary place. And what we do to prepare it creates that space. Another author says that, that's Ian Strawn, and he said that sacred space is itself ritual practice and not simply where it happens. So you can go somewhere that's very ordinary, you can see a client in somewhere that's very ordinary, but it is the doing of what you do over and over and over again that differentiates place from space. For him, sacredness was found in the practice rather than the physical surroundings. And he says it was in the learning, the doing, the repeating, and the improving of the practice that the places in which this practice occurred became the ongoing vehicle for practicing placemaking. So he's saying that it's not just you create it once and then that's it. It's the ongoingness that opens that space up, if you like. And it's not just doing it once, it's reflecting on it, it's doing, it's repeating and improving, which of course is so fundamental to any praxis, to any way of getting more refined and understanding and relying on the skill that we do. And this accorded with what the astrologers that I interviewed described as being skillful in their trade. I love that expression. Barbara Dunn said this. She said, it's being skillful in your trade, like being a painter or any other trade, really. And she said, when you do it over and over and over again, you just know. When it came, so that was how they prepared the space. And all 7 of them said that there is some sort of preparation. I think as we get more trusting of that skill, the preparation time of the space possibly becomes lessened, but nevertheless, it doesn't go away. So you might want to think about how you prepare the space for your clients. When it came to inhabiting the space, Ling Bell described how the space opened the moment that she opened the door. So having prepared the place, then how does she open that space? She says, remember, someone's coming with an intention to be seen in a non-normal way. They're coming with an intention to be seen. They are opening up their history for you to help them shape their present. They're coming with the intention for someone to give them information about themselves. So as soon as I open the door, the space is opened. So there wasn't a sense of Lynn was waiting for them to come into her space before, or her place before something happened. It was the moment she opened the door and saw them face to face. And if you're doing this online, it's the moment that you connect with that person online. While Lynn identified that the chart reading space was specifically for information exchange, so we go back to that point right at the beginning, they're coming to exchange information. The information she understood was of a non-normal type. And it might be that clients come to us and they want to know about business issues or marriage or relationships or money. It's mundane information, but it is non-normal because it accretes to something else. It goes deeper than just information exchange. And it was information that she said was predicated on her ability as the astrologer to reveal something new to the client. But also it was the client allowing that to happen. And she described it as that space between her and the client as a Vesica Pisces. It was a space of overlap. So here's Lynn, here's the client, and here's that space of overlap. And she said with some people you have a very small overlap, and with other people you have a much bigger overlap. And she was trying to find a word for that. And she said, it's presence, let's say. She was trying to give shape to something that was happening for her experience of it. And in exploring this word presence, I asked her, well, what's the quality of that presence? And she said, I think it is something more than me in the small definition of me. And whatever you call that or name it, it's something that steps out of the boundary of an ego identity. And within that unbounded space, the whole astrological consultation steps out of the normally identified I space. So it's very similar, isn't it, to what Mayra Epstein was talking about, how she just moves Mayra to one side and then she can do the work. But I pressed Lynn to explore this a bit more. And as she worked through what she was experiencing, she tried to find the best fit for that. I was saying to her, you know, is it a space where divinity is? Is it a space where something outside you steps in? Because this has been how some people have tried to define it. And she said, the space that opens between me and the other person allows this larger self to be present. And within the presence of the larger self is something larger than you and I. So that overlap space became much larger. So it's larger than you and I, and it's larger than us and them. And that larger space, whatever we call it, is definitely present in the reading. It isn't me. And she said, yes, that's a better response. Divine isn't the right word for it. It's like channeling something. It has the wrong connotation for the actual experience. So it wasn't that suddenly Lynn had left and another entity was taking over, although it can feel like that, because sometimes we make those leaps and we wonder where those leaps have come from. But she maintains she's actually there, and it's something about the connection between her and the client that creates this space that's much bigger than them. She felt there was a quality that was contained within the space of the consultation that was an amalgam of the two people, and much, much larger than something, but it wasn't losing herself, it wasn't losing her control. And even though Meira had talked about putting Meira aside, it wasn't like Meira had gone and was lost. She was just simply focused. Roy Gillett described it this way. He said, and again he uses this word presence, it's being in the presence of an understanding that we are sharing together. We could say a willingness, if you like. I remove myself as an ego-attached human being with opinions and judgments out of the story, so the client's life patterns reflected within the astrology can emerge. If I do my job well within the space of the chart reading, the client feels completely comfortable expressing their most profound secrets or anxieties or worries. And that's where some of the extraordinary effects of being in that space can occur, is that we open, or that space enlarges to contain both the astrologer and the client in a way that feels much larger than both the client and the astrologer. And that creates an assuredness, a sense of containment, but also where the client can be heard and seen and not feel that they are unsafe at all. And you might remember this is how Casey was describing this mesh work where the person is valued. When I asked Wendy Stacey about this, I asked whether she thought a horoscope invited a divine presence. She responded very, very quickly, and she said, no way. She said, definitely not. She said, that disavows the astrologer. And there's a really deep point she's making here. All those years that she spent learning how to read the symbols of the astrological chart, to say that we put that aside and we let someone else do that totally disavows what it is, the skill that she brings to the consultation. And she said, it's knowing people. She said, she's really saying it was life experience that was a really deep part of the process, because that way she could handle the client's questions. And that seemed to be what was being corroborated by all of these 7 astrologers that I interviewed. And that was why I wanted to interview them with more than 25 years experience, because was that a part of the skill set that astrologers brought to a consultation, and did that help them? And Wendy was definitely saying, and the others also, that this was so. And Roy added, let's be humble about it. There's nothing divine or special, anything about it. But then he went on to say, it's something pure. It's for the benefit of others. It's selfless. It's beyond attachment. It's honest. It's true. It's kind. It's humble. So he's really trying to grapple for how on earth do you describe this? We know we're in this space where there's this larger area between the two. We know that it's safe and that it can go very deep, but he's still reaching for a word that will describe it. He said, let just the truth come through. And as soon as you grasp onto spiritual meaning, that's where all the problem of religion comes in. So he was trying to say it's beyond that. What I'm doing, he said, all the time is trying to let the discipline of the chart inform and give authority in an appropriate way. Excuse me. So he was saying, by focusing on the symbols of the chart and by using the skill set that he brought, and creating a space that was safe for the client. The client could step in and the work could happen, which was free of ego. And it was, he said, and the other astrologers I interviewed said the same thing. It was not something else that was coming in to do the reading. It was him. It was him. And in that space, then this sense of presence was there. So, the summary so far, the consultation space, these astrologers were telling me, is a combination of two people, astrologer and client, and the astrologer's willingness to engage in and comprehend the questions posed by the client via the symbols of the horoscope. So what is the client bringing me? That's how I understand that part of the chart. So it was an energy between astrologer and client. And this is what Durkheim was saying, because he said sacred space was socially constructed, first by the rituals we do, which our astrologers said was the cleaning, creating the space, and then setting that space aside and reinforcing it by that ritual, by continuing to do the same thing every time we saw a client. But as we've seen with Kim Knott, she said those places could be ordinary. They didn't have to be particularized. It was also achieved through the overlap of space between astrologer and client. And it contained the feeling of the presence of something bigger than both of them. And it only occurred with the astrologer putting aside their ego or their sense of ego identity. And finally, it was described as being qualitatively different experience to the energy felt in the astrologer's daily life. And I think it is this qualitatively different experience that we sometimes call sacred. So then, therefore, I was still exploring the nature of sacred. And in order to understand this and to look at this through another perspective, I turned to the work of Henri Lefebvre, who is a neo-Marxist existential philosopher and a sociologist. And in his 1974 book, The Production of Space, he argued that the creation and the meaning of urban space is the result of social processes that engaged with geography, landscape, and property. So urban space was an amalgam of how we needed to use it. And it could be tracked through a history of change. And that change, he said, in Western Europe was transformed through Christianization, when the countryside became urbanized and space was its shaping factor. So the rise of Christianity tended to create towns and urbanization and created urban space. And when this growth of towns in the late medieval Europe was linked with capitalism, then urban space became a tool of power. And he saw that space involving a triad of physical, mental, and social attributes. And he divided it in this way. He said there was perceived space. So this is the urban environment around us. Perceived space, le perçu, was the physical web of routes, systems, and networks of our daily routines within that urban setting. So it's the daily paths that we take and the routes we take on our mundane, everyday environment. We've got conceived space, le conçu, which was the space that was conceptualized by urban planners, cartographers, and social engineers. So it is how the space is set up, not necessarily by us. So it's the physical environment of the town. But then he said there is representational space, or the lived space of the imagination. And it was within the physical space, of the physical urban space, that there are things which nourish us and feed us, such as the arts and literature, museums, art galleries, so on and so forth. And we use the physical world to create a symbolic language for us. For Lefebvre, the lived space of the imagination was animated, and he saw it in this way. He said the lived space of the imagination was nourished by the language of story. We create a story within our lived space, how we engaged with the perceived and the conceived space to make sense of it. We don't just walk down a street. We have an agenda, we have a history, and we symbolically understand what is around us. And it was, excuse me, this, just one moment. It was this third space that gave meaning to what was around us. And we can use Lefebvre's model to understand that he says representational space is alive. It speaks. It has an effective kernel or a center. And then he says ego, bed, bedroom, dwelling, house, or square, church, graveyard. It embraces the loci of passion, of action, of lived situations, and so it immediately implies time. Things happen in time in this representational space. And so it can be qualified in various ways. It can be directional, situational, or relational, because it is essentially qualitative, fluid, and dynamic. So he's really saying that you don't just exist, you live in something that is alive in time, which Bernadette Brady has argued is what the horoscope is. The horoscope for astrologers is a symbolic map of our known environment, and it flourishes through action and through time. We know that it's not a map in the way that you can unwrap a map of your environment and walk from A to B, and yet we know that it does give us processes of how to move from one situation or one type of behaviour to another. So using that, then, we can now apply this to a consultation speech, a consultation space. So I think it can inform the consultation process. We can see that Lefebvre's conceived space, which I'm mapping to the horoscope, it's evident to the astrologer drawing up and constructing the horoscope. Lefebvre's representational space equates to the lived life of the client. It's their background and their history that they bring to it. And the representational space is the meeting of astrologer and client, where the horoscopic symbolism merges with the client experience to produce for both the astrologer and the client this flourishing dynamic that these astrologers have been calling presence. Wendy Stacey expressed it this way. She said that aliveness defined by Lefebvre as representational speech was catalyzed by the conversation she had with her clients. But until that conversation happened, the chart wasn't alive. She said it was like a still photograph. And then she said the conversation with the client was like sticking it in the dark room and seeing it emerge. It's showing her age, you know, when we used to develop photographs in a dark room and see it come through. There was a moment, she says, when she, the client, and she paused, she said, identified something. The client recognized something about herself that she hadn't up to that point. And that was the moment when something happened. Something changed in the consultation and it became less superficial, something much more meaningful, and a much deeper conversation happens. It wasn't chat, it wasn't information exchange, it was connection, it was engagement. And she said, and that's when good work happened. She said, and then it starts to move. It becomes life, because it's that moment that turns into life. It's like an Instagram, she said. And Brian Clark said, it depends on the engagement that I have with the client. If there's no engagement with the client, nothing happens. It's like a dead sheet of paper. It was like Wendy saying, it wasn't alive, it was just flat. It's two-dimensional. But when the client is alive with me, it's 4 or 5-dimensional. And when Ling Bell also talked about the chart becoming animated, and I asked her whether the chart changed when she connected with the client, and she said, no, the chart doesn't change. The chart is the chart. But the way the chart comes alive within my ability to use it, the chart is animated. So they're all talking about this presence as being alive and animated, just as Lefebvre was talking about representational space becoming animated and dynamic. So for these 7 astrologers, it was this moment of recognition that occurs. There was a piece of information that they offered to the client from the symbols of the horoscope that becomes understood by the client through their lived experience in a way that previously had simply been information exchange. And from that moment on, the space became a vibrant, living scenario. And the whole tenor of the chart reading space changed. It was, as far as the astrologers I interviewed were concerned, still conversation, but it moved from being superficial into something that was much deeper and much more meaningful. And when these astrologers recognized, and what they recognized and conveyed was that there was the point at which these clients' horoscopic landscape, what was inside them, not only matched their inner landscape, it actually illuminated it. And in that matching became new insight. Fresh light was cast on the situation. At that point, the astrologers felt that they become much more effective in their ability to offer meaningful information to the client. And so, as a consequence, the quality of the space of the chart reading changed. If we take this inner landscape and look for people who work in this field to describe actual places, we can gain another insight into what's going on in this consultation space. In talking of actual landscapes, Belden Lane has written of this experience. So he's walking into actual landscapes. He's trying to give us an understanding of what it feels like to walk into a landscape when there is a recognition. He said, it's like being strangely welcomed by seemingly unreceptive terrain. And that there was a huge physical reaction of recognition that followed when that external landscape matched his internal landscape. Now, he was writing of actual physical landscapes, but his response was very similar to one that had been described in an earlier work by a woman called Meinred Craghead. And she found herself amongst the sandstone flats and the underground kivas of the Pueblo Indians. And she said, when I came to New Mexico in 1960, I found the land that matched my interior landscape. So there was something she held inside herself that she recognized and understood. And it was only when she walked into this particular landscape that she says, the door separating inside and outside opened. What my eyes saw meshed with the images I carried inside my body. Pictures painted on the walls of my womb began to emerge. And she felt the separation between physical and internal landscapes meld together. Another way of describing this is, and this is Edwin Birnbaum talking about walking amongst mountains, and he says, the sacred does not simply present itself to our gaze. It reaches out to seize us in its searing grasp. What we have with these these authors who are describing physical landscape is a sudden melding, a coming together, a recognition of something that's very deep inside them, which until they hadn't seen that external landscape, hadn't happened for them. They had to see it first of all for them to know that that's what was happening. And it was a powerful experience. And all 7 of my interviewed astrologers expressed a similar recognition response. And what was meaningful to them symbolically became meaningfully translated and understood by the client. And the client felt that they were seized by this recognition, as did the astrologer. It was a two-way thing. We can just add in here that there's another way of talking about these mundane spaces as differentiated and undifferentiated spaces. Thomas Tweed has said that no spaces are entirely profane or solely sacred. We've talked about how we can create this space in offices or just ordinary rooms. But Tweed has actually placed space, sacred space, on a continuum. And it's differentiated to undifferentiated. He says differentiated sites are those that are imaginatively fleshed out or encountered through the senses that make them distinct, remarkable, and separate. And the encounter in these spaces is multi-sensorial and deeply emotional. Undifferentiated spaces are areas that are totally unremarkable and they can't be reached by the senses. And we pass through these spaces every day of our life. But it also means that places like a movie theatre or a sports stadium can be included on this continuum. And he further goes to say, spaces are processes rather than objects, and both are affected by history and changed over time. And so when it comes to devotional or sacred spaces, he said, they are generated by personal insight, metaphorical imagination, and ritual practice. Remember, he's not talking about astrological consultations. He's just talking about the spectrum of space. But they're also generative and exerted agency, shaping the people who shaped them. So, and this is the feedback loop that we get from our clients, that we say something and it resonates with them, and that then shapes our ability to take that space into a much deeper place. When trying to articulate the experience of reading a chart for someone, Lynn put it this way, and she didn't reach for the easy option of relinquished responsibility by suggesting she was talking with the gods or the divine. She wasn't talking about that at all, and yet it was for her still sacred space. She articulated it through a dream, and she said, I dreamt that I was Mozart's niece and I was giving a concert, but I didn't know how to play the piano. However, when someone else sat down with me, I played beautifully in my dream. And she said to me, I can't play the piano. I've never learned any music, but in my dream, I had this experience of playing, but only à quatre mains. That means 4 hands. Only when another person played with me. And I think that my gift as an astrologer, she said, is a 4-handed gift. And playing that particular music is something that can only happen with the other person. So my gift is the interaction with the other. It's an other-related form. For Lynn and all my other clients, they experienced this space of the astrological chart reading as something that occurs initially in undifferentiated space. And their skill was being able to move from undifferentiated space to a space where something was meaningful. It was an engagement with the astrologer and the client. And each time it became that created differentiated space. So we can take Durkheim and all these other authors, and we can see that what the astrologer and the client is doing is akin to how they have seen space and place, but working in other fields. Meira Epstein's, according to Durkheim, sacredness was inherently impermanent, he says, and it had to be created and recreated anew each time through that participation of, we would say, astrologer and client. He would say between the person who was creating sacred space for themselves. So it's not as if you can come back into the room after the client has gone and still walk into the sacred space. There is a sense of the space opening and then closing. Oops. Meira Epstein says, she compares it to the Michelangelo metaphor, which I'm sure all of you know. And she says, I'm not comparing myself to Michelangelo, but when he looked at a piece of marble, he saw the statue in it. And her job is to chip away, to work with the client, to work with their history, to work with their lived experience, to allow the angel to emerge. And the angel emerging was that moment of insight, which creates that much deeper space, the quality that we all love to get into and we all work towards with client consultations. So, is the consultation space sacred? The astrologers that I interviewed in some way prepared in readiness for the client by cleaning the space mentally. There was that ritual of cleaning and creating the space, what Durkheim would call a special space set aside and reinforced by ritual that became sacralized. The encounter occurs in the space of the ordinary, but it becomes extraordinary. There was a knowledge exchange that was akin to the storied landscape of the horoscope, the storied landscape which Belden Lane has talked about as being a recognition that's very deep. And Minehead Craghead says her interior landscape suddenly matched her exterior landscape. She was in a place of recognition. And Edwin Birnbaum said, it reaches out and grabs you. The lived space of the imagination was how Henri Leflevre put it, that this was something that was created and was thick and was fecund. It was deeply qualitative with this understanding of the history, and this something much deeper could then occur. It was an inhabited and differentiated storied landscape of the horoscope, which became recognized and valued, and it became a thickened place, as Edward Casey said, where the client's horoscopic landscape matched the inner landscape, and that much deeper conversation could occur. And it was not necessarily something that stayed there continually. Spaces were processes and changed over time. It was Durkheim who noted that ritual and belief makes sacredness every time it emerges with the object or the process. So we create spaces as astrologers, and we work with that space and the other to create this sense of depth, recognition, intentionality, value. And then it reaches a much deeper level, which in this thickened space allows the work to happen. Objects or places were made sacred by groups of people, Durkheim said, who set them apart and kept them bounded by specific actions. So, gathering all of this energy together, I think, yes, based on the evidence of this research, I would argue that the inhabited space of the horoscope is a sacred space. It's a space we can't live in continually because it has this heightened reality and it's very intense and focused. It is a place where work occurs, good work, we hope, most of the time, where the client can walk away changed by what they've encountered. It's a space that has to be left, but it can be visited often. Each time we do a consultation, we revisit that space, and it informs and enriches both client and astrologer. And that is where I'm at. Thank you.
Thank you, Darrelyn, for a very inspiring speech. Can you hear me, or should I come closer to the microphone?
Oh, I can hear you, Yoka. I can hear you.
Okay, that's great. I was a little bit late in switching on the microphone, but you missed the pause.
That's okay. Yoka, would you like me to stop sharing so that people can see me, or shall I leave this up?
I think it would be great to see you full size on screen.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Everyone's waving at you. I'll translate.
Good. Thank you. Thank you.
I think it was a very inspiring speech to which makes me think about what it is we actually do aside from preparing a consultation, the technical bits of it. So I wonder if there are any questions in the audience, or if anyone would like to share their experience.
Yes, actually, Yoka, thank you. I mean, if anyone out there resonates with this, please let me know, because I think it's more common than we actually understand, and we don't get to talk about it in this way. So yes, I'd love to hear from people.
Yeah. So Darrelyn would love to hear also some experiences from you.
I'd like to share my experience.
Je mag hem gewoon, als je wil, in het Nederlands brullen, want dan gooi ik hem zo de microfoon in. Dus ze hoort je niet direct.
Ja, oké. Ik vertel altijd vanuit wat James Bell, de Jungiaanse psychologe, die schrijft in haar boek over synchroniciteit, die bijbelse opmerking van klopt en u wordt opengedaan. Wordt dan degene die tegenover je zit en zich openstelt voor wat jij doet, die maakt het proces mede mogelijk. Ik vind dat zo mooi zoals Ling Bell die overlap verwoordt. En zo heb ik 1 keer een hele rij mensen voor mijn laptop gehad. En er zat er eentje tussen. En die zag het helemaal niet zitten. Die wil wel eens even horen wat die rare astroloog over die horoscoop zou zeggen. En op dat moment ging alles op slot. En ik voelde me helemaal dom en onzeker. En ik denk, ja, maar dus slaat inderdaad nergens op. Dus wat ik heb gezegd sloeg ook inderdaad nergens op. En toen heb ik zo duidelijk ervaren dat het een wederzijds proces is.
Ja.
Dat die ander dus ook moet openstaan. En als hij dat niet doet, dat ik als astroloog dan ook helemaal onthand ben. En nergens meer bij kan.
Ja.
Ja,
nee, heel erg leuk. Dat vindt ze ook leuk om terug te horen, de responsen. I'll try to reflect on this. I can't repeat everything, of course. This lady in the room, she experienced that the process of the consultation is really something that is happening between two people, and it's not just a chart reading. And she experienced there were people lining up in front of her computer to have I take it a short reading or a speed reading, yes. And there was one person in the line who didn't trust the process or the astrology, or who was a little bit skeptic, skeptic. And she experienced that she completely shut down when that person was actually sitting at the other side of the table, and she felt the skepticism, and then she blacked out. Like, so it is a mutual energy that keeps flowing, and it's not possible to do a proper chart reading if the person at the other end is not open to it and is not participating in the process.
Yes, absolutely. I totally agree. And I think there is such a thing as our clients. You can have someone come to you. I would suggest that person, they might have been skeptical, but they weren't the client for this person in the audience. And we hopefully can start to see by the questions that are being asked when a client comes to us or makes contact with us, whether they're our clients or not. It takes a great deal of courage to say, I'm not the astrologer for you. Of course, in that sort of situation, you don't have a choice. They're just lining up to have that experience. But yeah. And Brian Clark was talking about the dead sheet of paper, and Wendy was saying that it was just lifeless. It doesn't come alive. And yeah, exactly. That's totally agree with you. Totally agree.
Makes me wonder, Darrelyn just suggested that maybe sometimes a client phones you and you feel this is not my type of client. Is there anyone in the room who experienced that and decided to decline the consultation and refer the client to someone else or whatever? Any experiences with that? I see recognition here. Yeah. Would you like to share?
To be honest and tell if you don't have the right vibration, then it will not work.
Yeah.
Because space is not only sitting here, but everything in the cosmos.
Yeah.
So she understands that.
This
Saying no is also a good business view. Because the person will respect you also more that you say, you say no to me, so I understand. Maybe I'm not the right time. Come back in 2 weeks or 2 months.
Yeah. Yeah. Could you hear what he was saying?
I did, yes.
What a great mic.
I just missed the first bit. Was the gentleman saying that he had done that in the past himself?
Yes.
Yeah.
In all the years, maybe 2 or 3 times I had somebody, but it happens.
Yes.
And he thinks it's business-wise better to decline a consultation than knowing you will deliver a bad consultation.
Exactly. And the experience of doing the bad consultation is it just feels awful. It feels hard. It feels difficult.
Yeah.
And whereas we know that that's not the experience where work can happen. Good work can happen.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Mm.
Are there any questions?
Can I speak directly to Darrelyn?
We can try if she can hear you, and otherwise I'll repeat it. Yes.
I can hear you.
Okay, I try to speak directly to you. First of all, I want to thank you very much for your thorough and very deep and inspirational lecture, and shining light on a new and not it's a new field for us, I think, as astrologers. It's not examined so far, so that's what we need for more consciousness. And the second point I want to express is, as I feel it, not just astrologers are working with a sacred space, but also counselors, priests, therapists, all kinds of people. So the wider field would express that as well. And when I understand you well, you're saying the challenge is to go from the undifferentiated space to the differentiated space. But sometimes life is different, and it's not always possible, in my experience, to have the nice experience of the good work. Sometimes I find a client who's coming to me who is blocked, and that's okay for me. And sometimes I told the client after an hour or so, I have the idea that I can't reach you. And that happened to be the moment that we went to a deeper level. Because the client wasn't aware of it. When we are speaking of a special place, a sacred space, it can be threatening for a client. It's new, it's unexplored. So we have to be aware that we are also a kind of guide, helping the client to in this journey from one field to another, from one world to another.
Yes.
It's quite new situation. And to give an example, yesterday I had a consultation with a woman of 48 years. She has a very well paid job. And every year she comes back. I'm seeing her for about 7-8 years. She's coming back and tell me what's my next step. And I want to do this and I want to get further on. So she's very outwarded in her direction. And I can see in her chart that her inner journey is to go to letting go, to don't be in charge. And in my opinion, when a client is coming to me, it's not the ego that knows he has to come to me, it's the soul. So what I call it, we are doing soul work. That's what I sometimes tell people, I'm not working with your personality, but I'm working with your soul. Maybe you're very glad when I'm talking about your job, but I'm trying to connect to your soul because this is giving fulfillment. Not in the short term maybe, but later on. And in these 7-8 years, this client, every year is coming a layer deeper, connecting a little bit more. And see that every time she has to come back to hear the story again. So she can let go. So it takes time to go to this sacred place.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's very insightful. And several things you've said there I can pick up on. Just the clients who do come back year after year to hear the story again. I think that's they somehow go back into their mundane lives or their other lives, which are very rich and nourishing, and they forget the story of who they are. And sometimes we just need to keep saying it over and over again when they come and see us, so they have the courage finally to hear it and then to go out and to be masters of their own life in whatever way that is. And the other point you made was that, yes, there are many people in society who create that sacred space, such as people of the cloth or counsellors. But I would argue that they are more accepted in our society. People think astrologers, they have all sorts of ways of looking at astrology, but they think that we are automatons or robots, and we are predicting a future that is set in stone. I think they would be quite shocked to actually understand what it is we do, and I think that's helpful, therefore, to be able to make the bridge to tell them in words they understand what it is we do, so that it can reach a more respected place in our society. But thank you for your insights. Yeah.
Okay. Maybe someone else? Maybe someone who likes... Yeah?
One more thing.
Yeah.
In my teaching, I teach the students that I believe that the developing of this possibility to connect with this space is growing while you are studying the symbols of the chart. So being busy with the symbols is a way to develop this skill to connect with. I believe it. Do you agree?
Yes, I do, because as we understand the depth of the symbols, and that's what a symbol is, it never has an end, it just keeps on emerging. That way we learn about ourselves plus the life experience, which means we've got greater richness to give to our clients. So yes, I do agree. Yeah.
Any other questions, remarks, or?
I participate often in a training where all kinds of businessmen come, and well, they come for the training, not for me, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an astrologer in the training, and they said, well, why? They don't understand. Well, but there are always men who are very skeptical, then you start the session, and they are really skeptical. And then I've experienced that as I do progressions, and I say that something about their life, about the future, sometimes, you know, then they say, well, I'm clairvoyant or so. And I said, no, not at all. It's just astrology, you know. And then they start to open themselves because they recognize something that is true, because they are all mental and they want to hear something true, you know. And then there's an opening, and then you can talk also about themselves and about their experiences and about their development and so on, you know.
Yes, that's lovely. That's very worthwhile work you're doing. Lovely.
Yeah.
I think sometimes as an astrologer you are 1 0 behind before the consult and 1 0 in front after the consult.
You're at disadvantage at first, and then at the end of the consultation, you're at the advantage, and they respect what you do.
Yes, yes. And isn't that wonderful where you get the nervousness to start off with, and then they realize the power that's come from the reading. Yeah.
Maybe I can share something of my own experience. Of course, I already listened to your previous research work on how do astrologers read chart, which is a very nice combination to have the two, of course. But what I realized is when I prepare for consultations, then I've done my chart preparations, but on the morning, let's say the client arrives in the afternoon, the whole morning for me is dedicated in tidying up the room or cleaning or doing something really silly, you know?
Yes, yes, yes.
And I thought I was the only one doing that. But it was for me a way to get into the skin of the person who was going to arrive. The chart I'd seen, but who I'd never met. And for me, that was a big realization that there is more to a consultation than we tend to think. And also, after the client has left the room, I'm not able to do another consultation right after that. I can't line them up in a waiting room or whatever, because there is this energy in the room, there's happening something in the room, and I need some time to let that go and let that get out of my system before I would be able to do anything else or work on another chart. And I think at least you have made me very much aware that the consultation is so much more than just a consultation. And that's looking from the view of the astrologer. But I know that looking at the perspective of the client, it's the same. They are full of experiences and thoughts as well. And I love that you bring this to our attention and make us aware of those processes.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's joyful. I love speaking to astrologers about what they do, and then often they will say, but what do other astrologers do? And we don't talk to each other on this level. I mean, even you just thinking you were the only one who cleaned the space.
Exactly. Now I dare tell.
Well, I think the basis of every astrologer is we're all super Virgo. You know, we have to make it clean. We have to make it hospitable for the client to come into, so the work can happen.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Is everybody happy? This? Then I'd like to say a few more words, if I can. I want to thank you for being with us here today, and I know you have helped us by adding some more text to the PowerPoint slides to make it easier for us to hear what you're saying. And we really appreciate that. So thank you very much for that. And thank you very much for your time. And there's something I'd like to show to the audience. You can't see the video here, but this is expanded work from Darrelyn, and she wants to, she has a little present for everyone here in the room, and that's her previous work on how do astrologers read charts. And I've made a booklet so you can actually see it, but you'll get it as a digital version. It's in this book, and from this book you only get her paper, of course, not the whole book, but it's her previous research work, so you can continue reading and learning about what we do in the consultation room. So thank you for your
Thank you as well. Thank you, Yoka, for asking me to do this work, because it's not the normal run-of-the-mill astrological work, and but it's what I'm passionate about at the moment. So thank you, I really appreciate it, and I'm glad that I could contribute to this wonderful conference that I know is just going to be a joyful day. So thank you.
It will. You were the first lecture, and it was a wonderful start. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay, I'll let you know when the video is available, and Yoka, and you can then pass it on to anyone else.
Yeah, perfect. So let's give another big round of applause for Darrelyn. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Bye-bye.